some of the stuff that is on Georgia View to help you with today's material. So we're doing more philosophy stuff today. Occasionally we will detour away from literature into, nonfiction writing. We'll be looking, for example, at literary manifestos when we start talking about modernism. And I think a lot of it just because this does provide good context for you. Okay, so first thing we've got here is a short video in a series that is hosted by people at the University of Nottingham in England. The series is called Words of the World. It gives you a rundown of the history and shifts in meaning of a particular word. So they have one on enlightenment that you can go and watch, and it's short. It's maybe 3 or 4 minutes. All right, we have also a BBC in Our Time podcast on the life and thought of Mary Wollstonecraft. So, this should help you put some of her ideas into a larger context. We have a BBC history website on great thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment. This will tell you a little bit more about David Hume and some other Scottish thinkers who were operating around the same time, as well as pages from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Immanuel Kant and on David Hume. Right. That is quite the dome on that guy. I always tell a genius philosopher by the dome-like cranium. And that's David Hume. Right. Pudgy, smiling fellow. All right. So, as for the music that was playing at the beginning of class. This is a concerto for flute, strings, and continuo. Don't ask me what a continuo is, I don't know. Written by Frederick II of Prussia. Has anybody ever heard of Frederick? He went by, was often called by another name that indicates fantasticness, wonderfulness, power, majesty. Okay, he's often called Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great, like Louis XIV, followed the political philosophy of absolutism. But Frederick referred to his absolutism as an enlightened absolutism. So he was absolute monarch of his domains, right? All final decisions rested with him. But he was also a patron of artists and philosophers who he left more or less free to pursue their inquiries as they would, right? Now, Louis XIV was also a great patron of artists, right? Playwrights like Molière. But what do we know about Louis's relationship with some of these artists? Were they absolutely free to create whatever the hell they wanted? No.
You have to agree with it.
Yeah, if they painted the king or the court in a bad light, they were suppressed. If they painted important people who had the ear of the king in a bad light, they were suppressed, right? Frederick made more of an effort not to censor his proteges, although some of them still, ended up turning on him. When we read Voltaire's Candide, for example, there is an unflattering little diatribe against Frederick II in that. But he's trying to be a different kind of absolutist king, right? He is by no means a democrat, right? He is by no means interested in handing over control of the kingdom to the people, but he is interested in ruling for the benefit of the people and in enlightening the populace, right? So he is considered by some to be kind of like the prototypical Enlightenment monarch, or the ideal Enlightenment monarch. In fact, he's part of the model that Immanuel Kant has in mind for good government in this essay on what is enlightenment, right? So let's start with the Kant essay. Do you guys have any questions or comments about this? Anything that confused you? Anything that really struck you about it? How'd this go for you? Okay. Okay. Was there anything that was particularly interesting about it? Yeah, jump in.
What was he writing to? You said the Durst, or I wasn't sure like who he was talking to. You were talking about the Benjamin Franklin?
Oh, no, we're not talking about the Franklin yet. Although Franklin is writing to the scientist Joseph Priestley.
Okay, cool.
That's who that letter is written to. Yeah. We're sticking with Kant now on page 105. Yeah, James.
He was kind of just blaming other people. Like, there's no reason we shouldn't be able to think for ourselves and
Okay.
step up.
What do you mean by blaming other people? Give me an example. Can you point to an example here?
It says in the beginning of the second paragraph, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great of a portion of mankind after nature has long since discharged them from the stern. It just keeps going on there.
Okay.
And he just was saying, don't be lazy, don't be scared, just don't be afraid to think.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's entitled to their own opinion.
Yeah, if you are lazy or cowardly in the way Kant frames this, then what essentially are you making yourself?
A slave.
Yeah. By letting someone else do your thinking for you, by letting someone else tell you what you believe, you are turning yourself into a slave, right? If we look at the first paragraph here, right? Enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. Now, tutelage is a kind of archaic word. Does anybody know what it means to be under someone's tutelage?
Isn't it just like double checking yourself?
No, it's not double checking yourself.
You're looking to them for information.
Yeah, you're looking to others for information, but yeah, Casey.
It was the making use of your own understanding.
Right, that's what enlightenment is, right? Tutelage is a word that means guardianship. So if you're under someone's tutelage, right, you are under their guardianship. And so on the one hand, they protect you and feed you and clothe you, but you also have to do what they say. So tutelage is man's inability, according to Kant, to make use of his understanding without direction from another. This tutelage is self-incurred when its cause lies not in lack of reason, but in lack of resolution and courage to use it without direction from another. Superi aude, have courage to use your own reason. That is the motto of enlightenment. So what does he associate this idea of enlightenment with? What does enlightenment ultimately equal?
Your own thoughts and what you want to think.
Yeah, your own thoughts, thinking for yourself, not thinking through someone else. If you're throwing off this tutelage, you're throwing off this guardianship, what are you doing?
Being independent.
Yeah, it's independence, it's freedom, right? right? Thinking for yourself, right? What Kant calls enlightenment is the path to freedom. Right? It's easier, he says in the paragraph that James pointed to a moment ago, to remain a slave in some ways. Right? If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, and so forth, I need not trouble myself. I need not think. If I can only pay, others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. So what does he seem to be targeting here? I have a book that will understand for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a physician who will decide my diet. What is he taking aim at?
They hire people to do things for them.
Okay, on the
That's what led me to think that.
yeah, on the one hand, he's hiring this. He's going after a class of professional experts in various things, right? Who make their living thinking for others. But book, pastor, physician, do these represent particular institutions within society?
Religion.
Okay, yeah. Certainly religion, right? Organized religion. Yep, education. What about the physician?
Experience?
Well, a physician is a medical doctor, right? So what is it? What is it his business to know? Why is it he's qualified to tell you what to eat?
Human body.
Yeah, he understands the human body, right? He understands science. Now, is Kant suggesting in this essay that we should just pick up all of these things? We should just pick up all of the churchmen, pick up all of the teachers, pick up all of the doctors and drown them in the sea?
No.
What is he suggesting instead?
For people to get their own education and develop their own theories for things and learn.
Yeah, to know the fields in which these people are experts for yourself, right? And not just let them dictate to you what you think or what you're supposed to believe, right? So, what are the political implications of this?
Down with the king.
Okay? Or at least down with certain kinds of kings, right? Down with the Louis XIV style absolutist, right? The dominant model of kingship of the 17th century and part of the 18th. Where are we getting, by the way, down with the king from this? What else is going on? This is written in 1784. What else do we know is floating around in the cultural ether around this time?
People are branching off to new churches, like branching away from the Catholic Church, I guess.
Yeah, and that's been going on at this point for about 300 years, right? And, you know, these schisms provoke more schisms, until we have all kinds of little different Protestant denominations running around that don't agree with each other, let alone with the Catholic Church. But what else is going on? So, like worldwide, 1784. What's already happened? Yeah, go ahead, Valerie.
Revolution.
Yeah, American Revolution in 1776, right? And this touches off other revolutionary movements around the globe, right? There's ongoing, for example, revolution in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now the country of Haiti. You know, there's a revolution there that lasts for about 20 years. Right, we'll be looking next week at some of the sort of the founding documents of that particular revolution. There are revolutions going on in Spanish and Portuguese colonies in South America. Right? There are a lot of places around the world that are rising up against traditional models of kingship. So this equation of enlightenment with freedom, right? Do we think that Kant would be an unqualified supporter of these kinds of movements? These movements to break away from the old European kingdoms and set up new democracies in their place. You're kind of, Casey, you're not?
Well, he's not exactly influencing them to change things. He's just influencing them to take the things that already are and embrace them themselves.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so he's not necessarily calling for new structures. He's calling more for questioning the structures that are already in existence.
Doesn't that lead to people changing things about them? They question why they're set up the way they are.
Yeah, it kind of tends to. Right? Yeah, when you start questioning why things are the way they are, you tend to notice, oh hey, this is actually a flawed model in a number of ways. And you start pointing out the flaws, and then people want to correct the flaws, right? And yeah, and that is eventually how you get change. And Kant is the father of a mode of thought that in German is spelled Kritik, K-R-I-T-I-K, and that we usually translate into English as critique, spelled exactly, which sounds exactly the same. So, what critique for Kant is an attempt to determine the boundaries of human reason. Right? How far can thought, how far can reason, how far can logic take us? And he tends to start with an examination of existing structures. Right? This is the world as it is now. This is the world as it's been given to us. So let's look at it closely. Let's examine it in its parts, see how these parts work together, and see how far reason can take us in either fixing what's wrong with these parts or replacing them with something better. And this is kind of the dominant model of philosophy through the 19th century into much of the 20th. So, if we look at a little bit more of what he's got to say here. For any single individual, page 106, to work himself out of the life under tutelage, which has become almost his nature, is very difficult. He has come to be fond of this state, and he is, for the present, really incapable of making use of his reason, for no one has ever let him try it out. Statutes and formulas, those mechanical tools of the rational employment, or rather misemployment, of his natural gifts, are the fetters of an everlasting tutelage. Whoever throws them off makes only an uncertain leap over the narrowest ditch, because he is not accustomed to that kind of free motion. Therefore, there are only few who have succeeded by their own exercise of mind, both in freeing themselves from incompetence and in achieving a steady pace. So why is, according to Kant, enlightenment so rare?
Because people are afraid.
Yeah, they're afraid, right? What are they afraid of?
They're afraid of getting it wrong or afraid of backlash from the government or people in power.
Sure. It could go disastrously wrong for them. Right? So yeah, so they hold back because they're afraid. And really, many people are fairly comfortable being told what to do and what to think. At least that's part of Kant's argument, right? Thinking for yourself, taking that leap over the ditch is difficult. Right? It's something you have to force yourself to do, and it's something that largely runs counter to our instincts. So taking that fearful leap over the ditch requires an enormous act of will. Particularly when society is set up to prevent people from making those kinds of leaps, from doing those kinds of jumps. Right? From trying to get over to the other side all on your own, using the power of your own reason. But that the public should enlighten itself is more possible. Indeed, if only freedom is granted, enlightenment is almost sure to follow. For there will always be some independent thinkers, even among the established guardians of the great masses, who, after throwing off the yoke of tutelage from their own shoulders, will disseminate the spirit of the rational appreciation of both their own worth and every man's vocation for thinking for himself. But be it noted that the public, which has first been brought under this yoke by their guardians, forces the guardians themselves to remain bound when it is incited to do so by some of the guardians who are themselves incapable of some enlightenment. So harmful is it to implant prejudices, for they later take vengeance on their cultivators or on their descendants. Thus the public can only slowly attain enlightenment. Perhaps a fall of personal despotism or of avaricious or tyrannical oppression may be accomplished by revolution, but never a true reform in ways of thinking. Rather, new prejudices will serve as well as old ones to harness the great unthinking masses. Now, what does this phrase, the great unthinking masses, reveal about Kant's attitude towards the public at large?
They're all idiots.
Okay, yeah. That the great mass of people out there, right, the great unwashed, as it were, are by and large morons. Now, does he blame them for the fact that they're morons? Is it the fault of the public that they are, in Kant's estimation, so bloody fucking stupid?
It's the fault of the institution and society they were born into.
Exactly, yeah. It's the institutions that have kept them from getting smarter. So where does enlightenment have to come from? Is it a bottom-up movement or a trickle-down movement?
It has to come from within.
Okay, but I think I'm talking about socially, though. Like, if we're looking at society, yeah, it has to come from within the person. But does Kant seem to think it's going to come from within a member of the great unthinking masses? Now, where are they going to have to get it from?
The higher ups are going to let them like give information.
Yeah, this is socially anyway, yeah, the intellectual equivalent of trickle-down economics, right? This is, what's good for people at the top is going to be good for people down below, provided the people at the top are willing to share. Right? If the people at the top decide they don't want the masses in on their knowledge and on their enlightenment, it's not going to happen. But yeah, this has to come from the social elite. They're the ones who have to throw off the fetters of ignorance, and then they can lead the masses into a brighter tomorrow. Doesn't that all sound nice? But yeah, so this is still a pretty elitist, aristocratic model of freedom and enlightenment, right? For this enlightenment, however, nothing is required but freedom, and indeed the most harmless among all the things which this term can properly be applied. It is the freedom to make public use of one's reason at every point. But I hear on all sides, do not argue. The officer says, do not argue but drill. The tax collector, do not argue but pay. The cleric, do not argue but believe. Only one prince in the world says, argue as much as you will, and about what you will, but obey. Everywhere there is restriction on freedom. The prince he's talking about here, by the way, is our dear friend and composer of flute concertos, Frederick II of Prussia. Right? That even the enlightened absolutist monarch, he'll let you talk about whatever you want, he'll let you argue about whatever you want, but in the end, final authority comes down to him. Final authority rests in him. But he's also Kant's model of this kind of elite figure who allows knowledge to trickle down to everyone else. Right? The leader who can take the great unthinking masses, who can take the public into a better future. Okay. So anybody have any other questions or comments about Kant before we move on to something else? Okay, now this is sort of one model of Enlightenment association with freedom. Now, if we look at the letter from Benjamin Franklin to Joseph Priestley on page 128, right? It's very short. What do you notice going on? What seem to be the major points in Franklin's letter? What is he writing to Priestley about?
He had already written him a paper for one of his studies.
Okay, yeah.
It's kind of like a shake-up.
Yeah, Priestley had written in admiration of some speculations of Franklin's on the nature of the northern lights, the aurora borealis, right? So what does that in and of itself tell us about what their primary concern in correspondence is? What are they primarily interested in?
Science.
Yeah. And we have to remember, too, that the practice of science, according to a method of observation and experiment, in, what's the date, 1780, is still really very new. And is mostly conducted by amateurs. Right? I mean, Franklin is not a scientist by profession. No one was. Most scientists in the 18th century were wealthy gentlemen who pursued it as a hobby. Right? Franklin was by profession a printer. Joseph Priestley, his correspondent, was by profession a clergyman. So in what way does this letter touch on matters scientific, apart from just the basic situation, the rhetorical situation of response here? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, he believed that science will give rise to endless progress.
Yeah, there are still people who write in these kind of terms today about things like self-driving cars and what the energy sources of tomorrow will be and that sort of thing, right? It is impossible. The rapid progress true science now makes occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the height to which may be carried in 1,000 years the power of man over matter. All right, that's a key phrase there. Right, he equates science, Franklin equates science with man's power over nature.
I like how it predicted that the agriculture may diminish its labor and produce.
Uh-huh.
That's kind of what we
Yeah.
had going on here.
Yeah,
Day and
he
age.
yeah, there are things, right, that, in the future we won't have to work as hard thanks to science. Of course, then what often ends up happening is, machines are invented that take our jobs away. Because machines are cheaper than people. They don't require health insurance. So yeah, we may perhaps learn to deprive large masses of their gravity and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. What's he talking about here? What are we going to be able to do, he thinks? Depriving large masses of their gravity. Exactly, yeah. We're going to fly in order to transport people and things more easily. Agriculture may diminish its labor and double its produce. All diseases may by sure means be prevented or cured, not excepting even that of old age, and our lives lengthened at pleasure even beyond the antediluvian standard. So, what's his vision of the future look like? Yeah, we're going to live a hell of a long time, maybe forever. We won't age. We won't have to work very hard. And we can friggin' fly. Right? All through the power of science. Now, how does this sound to us? Okay, yeah. This sounds a little bit crackpot, right? That we could, actually cure old age. And yet, how much money do people spend on wrinkle cream, right? But yeah, I mean, he has this faith in the power of science to really to defy nature, right? Almost all of these things he's talking about are a kind of defiance, right? We defy gravity, right? That powerful natural force that keeps us all from hurtling off into the sun. We defy old age. We defy death. Right? We become free from want, free from care, free even from the surly bonds of earth. So science brings with it a kind of freedom as well. Right? If we can harness our power over nature, we're not going to be bound by natural limits anymore. So philosophically, the direction that Franklin is coming from is sort of related to capital O optimism. Right now, by small o optimism, what do we usually mean? If you're an optimist, what do you do? How do you think?
Glass is half full.
Yep, the glass is half full, right? I always look on the bright side. I always find the silver lining, right? Everything happens for the best. Capital O optimism is a sort of justification of that, an attempt to justify that belief, right? Often in spite of the actual evidence of your senses. Right? An optimist believes that the world is rationally ordered. Right? That it operates according to consistent principles. We can use science and math to determine those principles. And once we can do that, we can ensure that all outcomes are for the best. There are a lot of philosophical optimists who believe that the world is ordered for the best anyway. and that anything that happens ultimately happens for our good, even if it doesn't appear to be so at the time. This is another thing that we're going to be looking at in terms of Voltaire's Candide next week. Candide is it's a lengthy takedown of philosophical optimism. Basically, Voltaire thinks that this is a completely nuts, stupid idea. So Franklin is expressing this kind of optimism, right, when he talks about how harnessing nature, gaining power over nature, will allow us to defy these typical natural outcomes, right? Oh, that moral science were as fair a way of improvement, that men would cease to be wolves to one another, and the human beings would at length learn what they now improperly call humanity. Now, does that seem to be at odds with the tone of much of the rest of the letter? What does Franklin seem to believe science can't improve? This is sort of where he veers off from optimism a bit.
The nature of man.
Yeah, we can defy nature, capital N, right? But we can't defy human nature. So even if we can create a world in which we all live longer and don't age, in which we can fly people and things halfway around the world, in which the land produces more than we need with less labor, we still can't change the fact that people are basically rotten to each other. We still can't stop people from being cruel or selfish. Right? Scientific knowledge, power over nature, does not, for Franklin, actually improve the human person. And I think we can see some evidence of this actually in the David Hume portion here, right, of national character. Now, Hume comes from a different philosophical school. David Hume is what's called an empiricist. Now, I think we've alluded to this before. Does anybody know what empiricism means? What am I talking about when I talk about an empiricist?
Someone who conducts experiments and they take value in things that can be proved to be true.
Yeah, well, how do you prove something? How do you know what's true if you're an empiricist? Yeah, you only gain knowledge through observation, right? You only gain knowledge through sensory experience. Right, an empiricist would say we're not born knowing anything, right? We're born as blank slates. And we are formed, we are shaped by the sense impressions that we take in, that we gather throughout our lives. Now, everyone's sensory apparatus is different. So what does this do to the very nature of knowledge or objective truth? How can you ever really be sure that you know anything? You're shrugging, Brittany? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's to an empiricist, you can't. Essentially, nothing is certain because your senses can deceive you. And everyone's experience of sensory data is different. So you can't be sure of the truth of any particular proposition, right? The only things you can know are the things you gather through your senses, and you can never really even know those things for sure, right? That's the basis of empiricism. Now, that said, Hume here is speculating largely on an area that he doesn't actually know all that much about, right? When he talks about national character, he is speaking from very limited experience. Right? This is a kind of bifurcated argument. He's making two different points. The first is that people of African descent are inferior to Europeans. The second, that slavery and the slave trade are bad anyway. Now, what does his argument about Africans stem from? What is his experience about? Yeah, Brittany.
Pretty much like civilized based on what you see.
Yeah, based on, and who or what has he seen?
Yeah.
Right? For one thing, he's, in Edinburgh in Scotland, right? There still aren't a lot of black people in Edinburgh. The only people of African descent that he would have any cause to know or to meet, though, right, are who?
Slaves.
Yeah. His experience of people of African descent is entirely limited to people who are slaves of Europeans or Americans, right? And so from that experience, he is generalizing about an entire part of the world that he demonstrates he knows very little about, especially when he says in the second sentence, right, there scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even any individual eminent either in action or in speculation. Now, if we're talking about African civilizations, right, okay, big one that he seems to be missing, right, Egypt, right, the Kingdom of Mali in West Africa was also highly sophisticated. Right, there was the Ashanti Empire. There are all sorts of, what he's demonstrating is there are all sorts of things about Africa that he simply does not know. And he's simply dismissing this. Right? Well, because they're not like Germans. Right? The most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. So what he's showing here is that he doesn't, essentially he doesn't know how to imagine how anyone from Africa could be different from those Africans whom he has met, who have been broken down by enslavement. And yet when he talks about the practice of slavery, what does he have to say about it? Okay, yeah, that it's terrible. Why is it terrible? What makes it terrible? I mean, apart from the obvious. Pardon?
It's enslavement of another human, it's not letting them think for themselves.
Right, it's the same issue that Kant noted, right? That letting someone else do your thinking for you, or forcing someone else to accept what you believe is a form of enslavement in and of itself, right? So the very condition of slavery prevents intellectual development. And does it hurt only, according to Hume, the enslaved person? Is the enslaved person the only one who is harmed? You're shaking your head no, James?
He says they would gladly reduce the greater part of mankind to real slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of feel like he's saying, if you're taking the part of slave trade, then you're just lowering your value as a man or as a being. You know, you're really not doing the right thing.
Yeah, that it does affect the slave trader and the slave owner as well, right? If we look a little further down, right? The remains which are found of domestic slavery, page 130, in the American colonies and among some European nations, would never surely create a desire of rendering it more universal. The little humanity commonly observed in persons accustomed from their infancy to exercise so great authority over their fellow creatures and to trample upon human nature were sufficient alone to disgust us with that unbounded dominion. Nor can a more probable reason be assigned for the severe, I might say barbarous manners of ancient times, than the practice of domestic slavery, by which every man of rank was rendered a petty tyrant, and educated amidst the flattery, submission, and low debasement of his slaves. So for Hume, slavery is bad not so much because it harms the enslaved person, but because it degrades the humanity of the slave owner. So he sees it as a kind of dual bind, right? That the slave owner is bound to tyranny through the constant exercise of it, while the slave is bound to tyranny simply by being owned by another person. Yeah, Sydney.
What's that last word?
Humanity. Yes. Slave ownership degrades humanity. That would be Hume's argument. Right, and we see in a lot of 18th century thought, a lot of 18th century writing, right, these words, tyrant and tyranny. What do we think of when we hear the word tyrant? What's a tyrant?
Like a ruler.
Do we think of a tyrant as a just and humane ruler?
Terrible boss.
Yeah, a tyrant is somebody who has power over you and constantly lords it over you, right? Right, I'm in charge. This is how things are going to be. You're going to think what I think. So enlightenment for many of these thinkers is a weapon against tyranny. But not for most of them in the hands of the masses, right? This is actually something that Kant and Hume seem to have in common. Is it the potential subject of the tyrant who needs to be enlightened? Is it the person who might be ruled by a tyrant that needs to be enlightened? What's that?
It's the tyrant that needs to be enlightened.
It's the tyrant that needs to be enlightened, exactly. It's the tyrant who needs to have his humanity worked upon and improved. And then his enlightenment will trickle down through the cracks to the public. Right, so this is a point on which Kant and Hume would probably be in agreement. Right, that it's not the public that needs to learn to open its eyes. It's the people in charge who need to learn to open their eyes. And some of this is because, around this time, right, we haven't hit the French Revolution yet, where things get really nasty for aristocrats, but we are entering a period where aristocrats are starting to lose their traditional privileges, where people are openly revolting. And so, it's like, hey, if you want to maintain your position in society, maybe you better start listening. Maybe you better start thinking a little bit about where you are and what you're doing. Now, what broad class of humanity that encompasses about 54% of the planet's population do all four of these guys, three of these guys, Kant, Hume, Franklin, who are they ignoring? Who do they say nothing about?
Women.
Yeah, none of them has a word to say, really, about women, except Kant briefly alluding to a lack of enlightenment among the fair sex, as he says, right? Nothing in any of this about women.
So they want women to remain dumb, huh? That's messed up.
Yeah, of whatever class, right? That's doesn't seem to.
They're like, oh, everybody
Yeah.
had knowledge. Let's just have the women.
Yeah. And how, according to Mary Wollstonecraft, does society exercise its tyranny over women?
Through marriage, education, inferior.
Yep, through marriage, through inferior education. Page 134. Men and women must be educated in a great degree by the opinions and manners of the society they live in. In every age, there has been a stream of popular opinion that has carried all before it and given a family character, as it were, to the century. It may then be fairly inferred that, till society be differently constituted, much cannot be expected from education. It is, however, sufficient for my present purpose to assert that, whatever effect circumstances have on the abilities, every being may become virtuous by the exercise of its own reason. For if but one being was created with vicious inclinations, that is positively bad, what can save us from atheism? Or if we worship a god, is not that god a devil? So what assumption about human nature is Wollstonecraft laying out in paragraph 1 here? Basic human nature. Are human beings inherently bad or inherently good?
Bad.
Why do you say bad?
You said that the devil created us, so.
That's not actually what she's saying. Let's look at that sentence again, right? If but one being was created with vicious inclinations, that is positively bad, what can save us from atheism? Or if we worship a god, is not that god a devil? So she's saying if one being was, if one person was just born bad, then how could we believe in a God who is good, right? So is she saying that people are actually born bad?
No.
No, she's saying that they're not, right? That people are inherently good. Right, the sentence is a little bit convoluted, right? And it's, 18th century diction can get the better of us sometimes. But yeah, what she's saying is that people are inherently good. Are men and women, according to her logic, inherently any different from each other? It may then fairly be inferred that till society be differently constituted, much cannot be expected from education. It is, however, sufficient for my present purpose to assert that whatever effects circumstances have on the abilities, every being may become virtuous by the exercise of its own reason. So is there any real difference as far as potential is concerned between men and women? Yeah. Men and women are born with equal potential. So what does she think goes wrong then for women? Okay, yep. Right, society affects human beings negatively. What particular social force does she think has warped women? Right, we've already pointed to it.
Education.
Education, yes. It's because they're not taught to exercise their reason. Right, later on, she compares women to soldiers. Right, what is the basis of that comparison? How, for Wollstonecraft, is a woman like a soldier?
Because they're told by the people above them.
Yeah, a soldier is taught to obey. Right, a soldier is taught to drill. You do what the commanding officer says. Women are taught more or less the same thing. But there's something else that she points to as well. If we look on page 136, standing armies can never consist of resolute, robust men. They may be well-disciplined machines, but they will seldom contain men under the influence of strong passions or with very vigorous faculties. And as for any depth of understanding, I will venture to affirm that it is rarely to be found in the army as amongst women, and the cause, I maintain, is the same. It may be further observed that officers are also particularly attentive to their persons, fond of dancing, crowded rooms, adventures, and ridicule. Like the fair sex, the business of their lives is gallantry. They were taught to please, and they only live to please. Yet they do not lose their rank in the distinction of sexes, for they are still reckoned superior to women, though in what their superiority consists beyond what I have just mentioned, it is difficult to discover. So how are army officers, according to Wollstonecraft, like women?
It's kind of like they're taking care of their children, like women do. They take care of the people that they're responsible for.
Is that what she actually says?
Yeah.
What does she actually say? What she says is much less complimentary to the officers, right? What is she actually saying about army officers? In what way does she compare them to women?
They like the frivolous things, like dancing.
Yeah, they like dancing, romantic adventure, parties, gossip. Right, so she's suggesting that they've been warped in ways that are similar to the ways women are warped by social circumstances, right? If you're in the army, again, right, your business is not to question. Your business is to do what you're told and to try to please your superior. Now, she relates much of what she feels is wrong with women to a fixation on fashion. Essentially, that women are taught to care about social life, clothes, being pleasant, being pretty. Right? She actually has a real-life model for much of her complaint about women, a woman by the name of Lady Kingsborough, for whom she worked as a governess at one time. And Lady Kingsborough was a much admired woman, but not so much for her intellect, right? For her social skills. But the focus on social skills, the focus on pleasing, keeps women from being free, much as soldiers are bound to obey whoever is above them in the chain of command. Okay, so this has been a lot of stuff, and a lot of it's not really easy to digest. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? Any points anybody is confused about or wants to know more about? No? We're good? All right, I'm going to return your in-class writings to you in a moment. I have some reading questions for you for next time. So we're going to be looking at what is arguably the first novel in English. It's short for a novel. We're going to be looking at A for Ben's Orinoco, which is very much caught up with most of the issues we've been talking about today.